the immense pleasure of introducing my colleague and friend Lina Choueiri to introduce tonight's speaker.
Thank you. Well, I'm very happy to get the chance to talk about Abbas to his face. The first time I heard of him, I was a new graduate student at USC, and he had graduated a couple of years before I joined the program, the linguistics program there. And my advisor at the time would require any student working on the syntax of Arabic to read Abbas's dissertation. Fast forward to now, 2010, anyone, I think, who is interested in working on the syntax of Arabic or the morphology of Arabic has to refer to what Abbas has done first. His expertise in the field is what I think helped in getting him a lot of prestigious awards, including a recent NSF award to work on comparative syntax of 5 Arabic dialects. And I think this kind of work is bound to have important consequences for linguistic theory as well as teaching Arabic to non-native speakers, I guess. What I can add to that is that Abbas, as a linguist, is very multi-talented. He not only has done very exciting work in syntax and morphology of Arabic dialects, but he collaborates with computer scientists and computer engineers on work in natural language processing and machine translation. He's collaborated with other experts to do work on language acquisition of Arabic as a native language, and he's here today to talk to us about yet another project of his, which is his work on Arabic as a heritage language. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Abbas.
I'll sit here close to the microphone. Thank you, Lina. And thank you all for coming. It's really an honor for me to be here. Lina was very generous, but actually I learned a lot from working with Lina, and we have been collaborating without a former advisor at USC on research on syntax in general and Arabic in particular. And it really has been a pleasure being here. This is my first time here. Oh, it's not. Can you hear me now? Yeah. Okay. So it has been really a pleasure being here. It's a beautiful campus and it's very good. So what I would like to do here today is share with you some work that I have been doing with some students and colleagues at the University of Illinois. There we go. We are looking at second-generation Arab Americans and focusing on their language. And we are trying to approach it from different perspectives, from a linguistic perspective, from a pedagogical perspective, but also from a social linguistic institutional perspective. So before I say anything, I need to give credit to people probably who deserve more credit than I do for this project. Abdulaziz a student in the Department of Linguistics, Iman Saada, also a student in our department, and my colleague Lina who works on heritage languages with focus on Spanish. So this is the team that is working together on heritage Arabic, and did a lot of the work that I'm going to report on. So this is really a team effort. My contribution is just a small part here. So here's the outline of the presentation. First, I would give a background about what it means to know a language in order to situate the talk about Arab Americans. Then I will give you a brief background about Arab Americans and the heritage speakers of Arabic. Then I will report on some research projects that are underway at the University of Illinois with results and discussion, and then some general conclusions. So, linguists have been dealing with the questions of what it means to know a language. And when you open a linguistics textbook or a book by Chomsky, the first question that you see is that what do we know when we say that we know a language? What does it mean to say that you know a language? So, more specifically, what are the characteristics of linguistic knowledge? It's like when you ask about other cognitive abilities, like memory, or how you process auditory and visual input. What does it mean to know a language? There are different answers, but the standard answer within at least the generative paradigm championed by Noam Chomsky is that native speakers know the sound inventory of their language and how to combine them to form meaningful words without explicit instruction. We are talking here about native language. You don't get taught these things about your language. These are the things that you pick up from the input around you. So we develop knowledge of the sound inventory of the language and how to combine those sounds into words. Which combinations are allowed, which combinations are not allowed. Native speakers also know the word formation patterns in their language and how to derive more complex words. Borrow new ones from other languages, there's a typo there. Or completely invent new words. It's like the word Google or something like that. Native speakers know how to do that implicitly. They are not trained or given explicit instruction to do that, but they know how to form new words, how to process new words. They also know a lot about their syntax, how to combine those words. They start with sounds, combine them into words, and then they combine those words to form phrases, and from phrases to sentences, and sentences to complex discourse. Native speakers also know the sociolinguistic and cultural cues and markers that allow them to deal with complex social interactions. For example, they know what kind of registers to use in a particular social context. When to take turn in speaking, they can identify dialects and accents. So they have some dialect and accent awareness that non-native speakers sometimes don't have. This is why, for example, we hear people, say, well, this guy probably is not from the Gulf, and his Egyptian is shaky, so he must be probably from the Maghreb, from North Africa, probably. Just because the native speakers have this kind of awareness about varieties. It's like American English. You can tell probably that somebody is from the South or from the Northeast by listening to their accent. So the typical questions that you find in linguistics and psycholinguistics in particular are, how do we attain this knowledge? So how do we acquire our native languages? I'm not talking here about languages that we teach our students. Let's say English as a second language, or when we teach the Arabic Fusha to students in the classrooms. I'm talking about the native language that people speak at home and in the street. How do we attain that knowledge that is not explicit? This has caused an intense debate in linguistics. And the debate really centers around the role of the input, and that is what the child hears around him or her in the environment, and how does that help attain this linguistic competence. Because when you look at languages, they are different, unlike other cognitive abilities. We all process, the memory system, the visual system, they are uniform across the human species. But when you look at languages, you find Arabic is different from Swahili, which is different from Navajo, which is different from Japanese or Korean or Pidgin language or things like that. So it seems that the environment plays a role in language acquisition. Clearly, you speak Swahili because you were born probably in Kenya and you pick up that language. Or you speak Navajo because you grew up as a Native American in a particular region of the country where Navajo is spoken. The same thing with Arabic. So you could be of Japanese descent, but if you were born in Beirut, you are going to pick up the Lebanese variety of Arabic. So the environment does play a role. But it seems that there are also commonalities between languages. So the debate in psycholinguistics, psychology of language studies, is what role is the environment playing, and what role is whatever is out there is playing. That's really the crux of the debate in linguistics, the debate about nurture and nature, basically. So the answer one, version one, is that we have some inborn language ability that gets manifested in and shaped by the input. So you hear a language, but it is not going to some kind of tabula rasa, in kind of behaviorist sense of the term, but it is really, there is something there that is already there, and this input, the brain uses that input to come up with this language. So, and the reason is that because if you look at languages, and this is the work that we do, Lina does, I do, and many other people do, is that Arabic, English, Navajo, Zulu, and the 6,000 languages that is still spoken around the world, though they are fastly disappearing, they are built over the same underlying architecture, cognitive architecture, which is dedicated to language. So this is why we have what we call language universals. So when we compare these languages, we find some patterns that they share together. Though they look different from word order patterns, when you look at sound patterns, you look at morphological patterns, they look different. But when you probe deeper, you find that there are some similarities between these languages. And according to Chomsky, one of the proponents of this view, is that this is because there is something in there called universal grammar that is in the brain, that is dedicated to language, and that's why we have these similarities. The differences are due to the input. So that's one version. But there is another counter-proposal, and that says that actually the input and the environment, they play a major role in shaping our linguistic competence. So any shared properties among languages are not really due to some dedicated innate ability for language, but just to general cognitive abilities. The same abilities that we use to process visual and auditory inputs, to deal with, to navigate streets when we walk and things like that. Those are the same abilities that we deploy to learn a language. And also to the exigencies of communication, maybe culture. And there is a tug of war between these two approaches to acquisition of language, to the nature of linguistic input. I am coming to the heritage languages. This is just a broad background, because the heritage languages actually provide us with a nice window on this debate. But there are some areas of consensus, despite the debate that is really intense sometimes. There are some areas of consensus. And the consensus is that the environment does play a role in language acquisition, no question about it. But that also early and sustainable exposure is critical to attaining knowledge of native languages. This is why adults who learn a language as a second language do not attain the same native fluency that a child does. That's the difference. And that has something to do with the role of early exposure and sustainable exposure to language. And this will bring us actually to heritage speakers, because they have that advantage. Some methods of research and types of evidence that is used in language acquisition and research about these two questions, about what does it mean to know language and the role of the input and the environment. People have looked at child language, spontaneous and elicited. Spontaneous meaning that you just record them when they are speaking, or elicited where you set up some kind of task and you elicit some data that you want. People have looked at adult language, particularly second language acquisition of Arabic as a second language, Spanish as a second language, German or English as a second language. People have also looked at that to see, if we can get some deep insights into acquisition of language. People have looked at what is called language deficits. I put deficits between quotes. It's just there are different situations that arise where either you have somebody born with some linguistic deficit in some parts of the language, that's called the selective language impairment, where they may have some problems with inflections, let's say agreement or a tense inflection, and some cases have been documented in that regard. Or people, let's say, who have had a brain accident like a stroke, and they lose some linguistic ability. So linguists try to look at those to see whether that can give us some window on knowledge of language, why some abilities get damaged, others do not get damaged. How do those compare across languages and things like that. And also people have looked at new languages, what I call new languages between quotes, and these are pidgins and creoles. Pidgins are languages like trade languages, where people who speak different languages come together to trade. So they develop a system of communication that is called a pidgin. Now what is interesting is that that language might get transmitted to the next generation. For that generation, that's their native language. Okay? So that's a Creole language. What is interesting about that is that they can also give us some insight into the nature of language, because it is like an invention of a language. So if there is something up there in the brain that is dedicated to language, it should manifest itself in those new languages. Okay? The experiments that have been designed to deal with these issues include word recognition, priming techniques, sentence judgment tasks, sentence completion tasks, sentence processing, various things, and also some technological tools that are very sophisticated. I don't use them, but my colleagues do, such as eye trackers and various imaging tools like fMRIs and others. So, with all this research going on into the nature of linguistic knowledge and the role of the input, we have identified two types of speakers that people have been looking at. The first type is the native speakers, who attain full fluency in their language. That's, for example, for me as a speaker of the Moroccan variety, you know, I am a native speaker of that language, or Lina as a native speaker of the Lebanese variety. Okay, or some of you here as native speakers of American English. So that's the type of speaker, standard native speaker of the language, who grows up being exposed to a language. And then there is the second type of speaker, and these are the second language learners. These are, for example, for us, let's say for me, as a second language learner of French or English, or an American native speaker of American English, second language learner of Arabic in college, for example. So this is another type of speaker. These rarely attain native-like competence. I mean, you do get some rare cases, but they're really rare to get that kind of full fluency. You can always catch them somehow. Maybe problems with some idiomatic expression, maybe some problems with irregular morphology, maybe some problems with interpreting some very complex constructions and things like that. So though they approximate native competence sometimes, they still have difficulties. And for linguists, when we say difficulties, we put them between brackets because that can tell us something about language. Why non-native speakers, for example, attain some knowledge but not, they don't attain other kinds of knowledge. Why? What is it about? Some grammatical properties that they cannot handle very well, whereas others they can handle very well. What role does the first language play in learning a second language, for example? This talk is about a third group that hasn't received a lot of attention in this debate, though there is now really intense interest in this group, especially in the United States. These are called the heritage speakers, or community speakers, as they call them in Europe and in Australia. This is a third group that doesn't fit in any of those two categories that we talked about earlier. They sound native. For example, sometimes if you hear in Beirut, you may see Lebanese Americans. They come here during the summer. Some of them can speak Arabic. They sound native. They have no problem with the guttural sounds, for example. They can pronounce them. But you can tell that they don't have the full native fluency. So they are not like your second language learner, but they are not really native speakers in the standard definition of native speaker. So they are in between. Okay, so this is the third category that is now getting a lot of attention, not just within the pedagogical community, which has always known about this group, because we get them in our classrooms, but also the psycholinguistic community, because because they can tell us something about the nature of language. They do not fit the dichotomy of native versus non-native speakers. As I said, they have been exposed to their parents' language in childhood. So they are like native speakers, like us. For example, those who speak Arabic as a native language, they have been exposed to the language in the home. Some of them, that's the first language they have heard, because their parents speak only, let's say, Arabic at home. And we have done the ethnographic study here, and some students did confirm that, in fact, that's the language they speak at home, that they have been exposed to at home. Or if there is grandma and grandpa at home, that's the only language they can speak at home with them, because they cannot speak English. So they are like native speakers. They have been exposed to the language in a native setting, not in a formal setting. So they are not like second language learners. However, unlike native speakers, their exposure does get interrupted later in the teenage years. Typically in the teenage years, that's when it gets interrupted, especially when they go to high school and then college. Many of them, beyond 9, 10, that's when really you can start seeing a drop-off in their native fluency. The other thing is that distinguishes this group of speakers is that the heritage language is in contact with the dominant language, For example, Moroccans in Holland, they are exposed to Arabic or Berber at home, but they are also exposed to Dutch as a dominant language. Same thing with Arab Americans in the United States or Britain, exposed to English as the dominant language. Or North Africans or Lebanese in France, or Quebec, they are exposed to French as a second language, and so on and so forth. Which is different from what we have, let's say, as growing up as native speakers in the Arab world, is that we do not have one of those languages as dominant languages. You may have a bilingual education system like what you have in North Africa and Morocco when I was growing up, French and Arabic, but still, French was not competing with Moroccan Arabic at home or in normal situations in the streets when you go to the markets to buy things or things like that. It's mostly in some spheres of administration, of school and business, when you get some kind of competition between the languages. But that's not what you get with heritage communities. When you go outside the home, you can tell which language is dominant, because it occupies many spheres of life. So we decided to look at this group of speakers, Arab Americans, who speak Arabic as a heritage language, and see if we can learn something about their language. So we want to characterize their knowledge. Before we can say anything about them, first we have to do the work to see what kind of knowledge they have. We have this thing that they speak a funny language, excuse the term, but a lot of people have this sense that, they know something, they are not native, they are not second language learners, they know something. Our task here is to characterize that something. What is it? To do it in a kind of scientific manner, by collecting data, coding it, and then quantifying it, and see whether we can get some results. This is still in progress, so what I'm reporting here are really just the beginning of this research, and more needs to be done, of course. And we also want to determine their knowledge so that we can answer questions about language acquisition, what it means to learn a language. Language loss, because heritage languages get lost. There is, the United States has immigrants from all over the world, starting with the British and German and Scandinavian immigrants. But those languages are no longer spoken except English. Scandinavian languages are no longer there because, after two generations, languages usually are lost. So we want to understand how language loss happens. But also it will provide insights to the Arabic language teachers, and this is very important in the US, and I'm sure for here because you do get some of these students in your Arabic classrooms. To the language teachers who get these speakers in their classrooms. These Arab Americans, we get them in our classrooms. in the Arabic program. So we want to know what kind of knowledge they have so that we can tailor the program to their needs. We cannot, usually you put them together with the people who have never been exposed to Arabic before. And that has its advantages and it has its disadvantages. And sometimes teachers don't know how to deal with them. They get frustrated because they are too advanced in some respects. But they also have some problems with the formal language in other respects. So it can be a frustrating experience. So what we are trying to do, what other people are trying to do, is to characterize the kind of knowledge that we have so that some materials can be developed for this group of speakers. So let me give you some, so this was the background about knowledge of language. Now I'm going to start talking about the profile of Arab Americans. The people we work with are mostly students in Illinois, and Illinois has the second largest concentration of Arab Americans. Michigan, of course, has the largest concentration, but Illinois has the sixth largest according to the 2000 census. I'm sure that it's going to change because more are moving into Chicago area, and we'll see what the numbers are when the census is completed. It's underway. I think it already will go underway in a couple of weeks or so. The 2010 census. So the students in the Arabic programs, typically in the United States, what you get are students with no Arabic language and culture background. Okay, this is, let's say, in our University of Illinois, a student from rural Illinois has never been to the Arab world, has never heard the word of Arabic. Okay, and goes into the classroom to learn Arabic for various reasons. So you get that group of students. But you also get two groups. Sometimes they get confused. People call them heritage students, but they confuse the term sometimes. Who have varying degrees of language and cultural proficiency. You get Arab Americans, but you also get Muslim Americans in the Arabic classroom, in addition to the other group. Sometimes when people talk about heritage students, they group these two together. In our research, we focus on Arab Americans because for us, they are the true heritage Arabic speakers. The Muslim Americans are heritage in some contexts, like cultural contexts, but not linguistic context, because the language that they have been exposed to is a formal language through formal instruction. It's an interesting group to study, but that's not the group that we are studying here. Actually, nobody, as far as I know, has been looking at this group in detail. It's a fascinating group to look at. We plan to do that, but we are not including them in this study. We are focusing on second-generation Arab Americans who have learned the language natively, no instruction. So the Arab Americans that we have in the United States in general, these are people who originate from various regions of the Arab world, with various degrees of exposure to different dialects of Arabic. You get Egyptian, you get Lebanese, of course. Lebanese, has been in the United States for centuries, because that's the earliest immigration of speakers of Arabic, colloquial Arabic, started with people coming from Lebanon and Syria during the Ottoman period. But you also get now Iraqi Arabic, Palestinian, Moroccan, Yemeni. When I said spoken Arabic has been in the United States for a long time, written Arabic probably has been earlier, because there have been documented cases of slaves who could read and write Arabic. Okay? And there was a case well known I think in South Carolina, where a guy could read and write. He was a prince actually, back in Africa, and was taken as a slave. And, so Arabic has been there as a language, the formal variety. The spoken variety started coming later with immigration, especially from here to the United States. Countries of origin, this is from the Arab American Institute. This is not my own slide, I took this from the Arab American Institute. Again, this is based on the 2000 census. So these numbers, I am sure, will look different next year or 2 years later when the results of the census are released, of the current census are released. So the numbers are going to be different. If you look here, it's like we got 47% Lebanese, Arab Americans, but I think that is going to change because there are more Iraqis in the United States now, and Yemenis, and Egyptians than before. So those numbers probably will change. I don't know how drastically it will change, but I'm sure the numbers will look a little bit different. Some people include Muslim Americans, but Muslim Americans, the only exposure they have had to Arabic is really through formal instruction, or they know the script. So we do get sometimes, let's say, Iranian Americans who have been to the mosque, they have been taught classical Arabic, or we get Pakistani Americans or Indian Americans who have been to the mosque, they have studied classical Arabic, or we get Indonesian Americans, we get these people in our classrooms. And they know classical Arabic, they can read it, they can write it, but when they say they know, it's a very interesting term, because sometimes you can hear this, in fact, this is very formulaic, because it's memorization of the language. And if you look at the ethnic background of American Muslims, it's different from what we saw earlier with the Arab Americans. Here, the dominant group actually is the South Central Asians, the Indians, the Pakistanis, the Afghanis, the Bangladeshis. They make up the majority, followed by African Americans, and then the Arab Americans. But as I said, we are not looking at this group at the moment. We are looking at the Arab Americans. So here is the definition of heritage speakers. So that's the context that we have. So who are these heritage speakers? Well, Valdez is known as the person who really started this research on heritage speakers, and her definition is that these are individuals raised in homes where a language other than English is spoken, and who are to some degree bilingual in English and the heritage language. Valdez works on Spanish, and there's a lot of research on Spanish as a heritage language, especially in California, Arizona, Florida, but now also you are getting that in the Midwest as well. What are the motivations for learning Arabic? I need to hurry up a bit, I think. It's quite a long presentation, so I'm trying to move a little bit faster. This is from Aliya Roshdi, when she asked Arab Americans what's their motivation for learning Arabic. Ethnic identity, number one. Religious affiliation, fulfilling a language requirement, importance of Arabic from a global perspective, influence on parental advice. Lots of people think that the parents force their kids to learn the language. I don't think parents like to get credit for the kids going to the Arabic classroom, but I think it's maybe other reasons why they are there. But I see a lot of this ethnic identity and religious affiliation these days with students, actually. I think that is an accurate thing. Again, this is 2002, things might have changed since September 11th, and the issues of identity that are now coming to the fore in the United States. So I'm going to skip this about Muslim Americans so that we don't save time. So heritage Arabic speakers. These are the numbers that we have now from the 2000 census. Over 68% of the people over 5 years of age who declare to be of Arab descent say that another language, which we assume Arabic, is spoken at home. So a substantial number of people are Arabic speakers, speak Arabic at home in the United States. People of Arab descent who identify themselves to be of Arab descent. So they say, we are of Arab descent, we speak another language at home because we don't ask them which language. So we are assuming that that's Arabic. If they are Egyptians, that's the only language I think if they don't speak English, they are speaking Egyptian Arabic. But I think probably the new census probably will ask that specific questions. As I said, we are getting a lot of these people in universities. These are some numbers from the University of Illinois. As you can see, there has been a dramatic increase in enrollments in the Arabic program. I would say probably at least 50% of these are heritage or Muslim Americans. They are flocking to the Arabic classrooms. The numbers keep fluctuating, but the trend is upward. If you look over the number from, for example, we speak about 100, now we get at least 300 students per year in the Arabic program. So the research questions with regard to this group of speakers are, they can come in from different areas of language study. Some of them are psycholinguistics, some of them are sociolinguistics, some touch on pedagogical issues, and some are institutional. I will talk about the institutional issues at the end. For example, for psycholinguistics, what are the characteristics of the speech of the heritage speakers? What kind of words do they know? What kind of sound patterns do they know? What the morphological knowledge they have, the syntax, the pragmatics. Sociolinguistics issues, family, the role of family, the role of the community. What kind of connections they have with their ancestral home? Do they go there, for example, during the summer? Language attitudes. What the parents feel about them learning Arabic. How do they feel about learning Arabic? Are they ashamed? Are they proud to know the language? These are important issues that can play a role in language acquisition. Media exposure. Do they watch satellite TV, for example, Egyptian TV, or Lebanese TV in the United States? Because now with satellite TV, things have changed. I mean, you are getting lots of exposure to the language. I don't think people have looked at this at the moment. Diglossia. Some of them go to the mosque, let's say for the Muslim, Arab Americans who are Muslim. They may go to the mosque on Sundays and they learn also standard Arabic. What are the dynamics of these two, between these two languages that they are being exposed to? The pedagogical issues are staffing type of heritage language. When you have so many students from different backgrounds, some of them are speaking Yemeni as heritage language, Egyptian as a heritage language, Iraqi, Moroccan, how do you deal with that kind of classroom? You cannot say, let's just have something for heritage speakers, because these dialects differ. Okay, they are similar to a large extent, they share a lot of things in common, but they are different still. Okay? So we cannot say that they all share something in common. So what is this thing? Well, that's what the research needs to determine. What do they have in common as a group of heritage speakers? Instructional materials. There are no instructional materials that I know of that are really targeted to the heritage speakers. Lots of people just give some accelerated instruction. But that's not the same as targeting in the instruction to specific needs. Pedagogical proficiency standards. How do we measure this proficiency? And so with regards to project 1, we want to explore the lexical knowledge of heritage Egyptian and Jordanian. We focused on heritage Egyptian and Jordanian because we want to limit the study to a group of speakers who have been exposed to the same dialect, so that we can measure, we can get a nice number and measure the knowledge of those languages. We want also to test their morphology. How do they form plurals? Native speakers of Arabic know how to form plurals. How do they form plurals? Notion of minority defaults, I will touch on that later. And to test whether heritage speakers have internalized the notion of a root. Again, without explicit instruction, Arabs have the notion of a root. So for example, I give you a word like Faransa, and you can extract the roots from it. Farmas. Okay? You get rid of the vowels, you have the root consonants, and then you can start deriving words from it. That's what we mean by the notion of a root, jadr. Okay? Native speakers have internalized that. We want to see whether heritage speakers have also that notion of a root or not. The results are very interesting. Previous analysis. These are in the domain of language acquisition by children. We want to see first the baseline, what people have done with regard to language acquisition. This was a study done by Rabat and Farah, a study of the acquisition of non-plurals in Palestinian Arabic. There were 4 age groups, children basically, 12 children in each group. They want to give them 3 types of plurals, sound feminine, sound masculine, sound feminine, and broken plurals. And they gave them animate and inanimate nouns. Results. The results showed that sound feminine plural, okay, with the risat, for example, appear to be acquired earlier than other forms with children. Okay, by age 3, children, Palestinian children, have mastered the feminine sound plural, Jumal Mu'annath Salim. They also tend to over-regularize from broken to sound. So for example, if you have a broken, you would expect a broken plural. What you get a regularized broken plural. This is like English. Children, for example, instead of doing, let's say, foot, feet, they will say foots. Or give gave, they say gift, for example. They were regularized. That's typically, a lot of research in English has been done on the acquisition of the past tense, for example. The over-regularization that you get there. Arab children did exactly the same thing, as shown by this study. And the most frequent error consists of using the feminine plural, which is very interesting, because the expectation is that they would use the masculine, some plural, because many languages go for the masculine form as the default form. Because that's what we get in language. For example, when you conjoin masculine and feminine, the verb is plural masculine, not feminine. Okay? But that's not what the children are doing, Arab children. Omar, who did his dissertation on the acquisition of Egyptian Arabic in 1973, found that same thing with children in Egypt, that they show, she gave them nonsense words, so words that they have never heard before, and she will elicit the plural, and the plural she would get is the feminine plural. Again, replicating, well, the other study replicated her results. So we wanted to see how heritage speakers do, because they have been exposed to the language early. Remember, children as early as 3 years old get a handle on the feminine plural, and then later they get a handle on the broken plural. Our heritage speakers usually have been exposed to the language at least to the preschool level before they go to kindergarten. So they should be okay, because they have been exposed early to the language. So we focused on two dialects, Egyptian and Palestinians. For each dialect, we took two groups, 10 heritage speakers and 10 native controls. We want to make sure that we compare them to controls. So we have total 40 speakers. Not a large number by psycholinguistic studies, but heritage speakers, you have to get people to agree to come to the test and things like that. So, and this is typical of heritage language research. The numbers are not that huge, except in Spanish, where you get many of them. But just because of sheer size of the Hispanic community in the United States. So they were asked to fill out a questionnaire, tell us about the background, how long they have been exposed to language, what language they speak at home, whether the parents, both of them, speak Arabic and things like that, whether they have to travel back home. And the task, we gave them a list of 105 pictures. And the reason we wanted to do that is that because there is no research in this area, so we wanted to start with the basic database. So we got 105 pictures with English glosses, because that's the dominant language for them. And we asked them to name the object and provide its plural form. 1/3 of the targets were sound plurals and 2/3 broken plurals. So we also gave them we recorded the data and transcribed it. This is how we coded, and some of the results. So if you look at the distribution of responses to the singular, EHS means Egyptian heritage speakers and Jordanian heritage speakers, GAH. So you see that they are doing okay on the vocabulary, 72% for the Egyptian, 88% for the Jordanian. And they also gave us some incorrect responses and some non-responses because they don't know the word. In terms of the plural, and here you see the drop-off in the results. The words where they knew the singular, they couldn't tell us what the plural was, or they gave us incorrect one. So the accuracy drops to 46% for Egyptian heritage and 70% for Jordanian heritage speakers. And these are people who could pronounce those words correctly. So they didn't have a lot of problems with the sound pattern of the language. Okay? Or the stress and things like that. So you see there, compared with the Egyptian controls, you see that the heritage speakers did not do as well as the controls. plurals, there's a drop-off by more than 20% drop-off between the controls and the heritage speakers. When we come to the broken plurals, that's where things get even more difficult for them. For the Egyptians, we got 68% accuracy, and for the Jordanians, we got 78%. Sound feminine, look at the sound feminine compared to the broken. The sound feminine didn't have a lot of problems. I mean, still drop off, but not as dramatic as with the broken plurals. Here, long vowel plural, what we mean by this is that we wanted to see whether they have internalized the patterns of that native speakers have. For example, native speakers, you give them khatam, a long vowel, they know that there is a glide, a W hidden there. So in the plural, they say khawatim. We want to see whether the heritage speakers can do that. And as you see there, yeah, some of them could, but not consistently, so 82%, 75%. Geminate plurals. And this is also an important thing in Arabic morphology that we want to test. When native speakers of Arabic, when you get a geminate consonant like qat, as in cat, you hear the ta as a geminate consonant. As a native speaker, you know that those are two consonants. And in the plural, you break the geminate. You put a vowel in between. That's an indication that you know that you have two consonants there. And the native speakers know that because they know that the minimum root for an Arabic word is 3 consonants. So when you have 2, you know that there may be something there, beyond those 2 that are obvious. Okay? Well, for heritage speakers, many of them have problems breaking the geminate. They didn't know. So they will give you the feminine plural instead of giving you the sound, the breaking the geminate with a vowel inside. So we found a significant difference between native speakers and heritage speakers in terms of their knowledge of plural formation. So despite the dominance of the broken plurals, heritage speakers, like native speakers, generalize the feminine sound plural. So like the children, they generalize the feminine sound plural. And these results are consistent, they basically replicate Amar and Ravid and Farah. Why does the feminine plural seem to be easy to learn? Well, if you look at Arabic, is that the sound plural, the feminine sound plural, is semantically and structurally unmarked. The masculine sound plural is actually only for human, whereas the other one is more general, is unmarked. The explanation for why the broken plurals are difficult is because they require a lot of information that you need to know about the kind of vowel pattern and things like that. So it is a more complex pattern. We did also a study with the second language learners of Arabic, who are not Arab Americans. And there we found some interesting results that are different from what we found here. What we found there is they tend to generalize the broken plural, not the sound plural, which is not unheard of, because they are subjected to formal instruction. They are using a different kind of meta-language than the heritage speakers. I don't have the graphs in here, but we have done the work with the L2 learners. So the notion of a root that heritage speakers seem to have is really different from the notion of a root that native speakers have. For example, when it comes to the vowels, when it comes to the geminate consonants, they don't have that. So they have problem with those. The same thing with the geminate consonants. Let's go there because I want to go to the narratives. So again, we look at the morphology. We are still looking at the morphology. We find that heritage speakers, they are not like native speakers. They are not like people who learn Arabic as a second language, standard Arabic as a second language. They have some proficiency, but there are gaps in that proficiency. The gaps that we have found have to do with the notion of a root, the nature of the root, and how to map a root into a template. Narratives. So here, unlike the elicited task, here we just ask them to speak, narrate, and we record them. This is, I'm reporting here on the pilot study. I think I need to go up. This is a pilot study that we did Now we are doing the full study. So I'm going to report here on the pilot study, and I will show you some statistics from the full study that is still being done. So I just talk about 3 speakers, but now we are looking at 20 speakers. 2 were born in the US, and 1 moved to the US when she was 3 months old. So native speakers of American English. Both parents of each subject come from the same country. So they speak the same variety of Arabic, but we know that there are different dialects even within the same country. They were learning standard Arabic at the time of the study because these were college students. So we asked them to fill out a questionnaire, asking about family background, languages used at home, their views about a number of questions related to Arabic. We want to see what their language attitudes are about Arabic. We were asking them to talk in colloquial Arabic about themselves, their education, history, food they like, trip to their parents' countries, and narrate the story of Alwaleed. But now we are doing what is called the frog story, which is a standard story in psycholinguistics. That was done for other languages. We want to see how Arab Americans compare with speakers of other languages. So we take them using a digital recorder. And the patterns for the pilots we want to look at include the production of emphatic and guttural sounds, because these are the sounds that non-native speakers have problems with. The tense system, agreement, because in Arabic when you do agreement, it's a difficult system of agreement, because you have the prefix and you have the suffix on the same word, especially if you in the present tense. We want to look at the construct state al-idafa. We want to look at negation, because sometimes, especially the dialects with mush, sometimes the verb is in between the ma and the sha, sometimes they are, the ma and sha merged together. So we want to see whether they have developed that knowledge. And we looked at complex clauses. So I give you the profile of 3. Speaker Aoun. These, by the way, all of them signed the consent forms and agreed to be in this, but we don't review their names. She came to the US from Egypt when she was 3 months old, but went back to Egypt at age 5 and returned after 1 year. She speaks both Arabic and English at home. She learns Arabic at home, and she has strong interest in Arabic. She appears to master the phonetic inventory of Egyptian Arabic. This is what is interesting about heritage speakers. When they open their mouth, they start talking, you think, oh, this person knows Arabic, because they have no problem articulating the sounds. Native-like production of emphatic and guttural sounds. Even the small phonetic details this student could do. Insertion of the ependitic vowel, for example, which is a hallmark of Egyptian, but also in this area. For example, you say, a'ad, hnak, when you put them together, you insert a vowel. So we say, a'adni hnak, a'adi hnak, where you get a high vowel there. People have worked on this. We want to see whether, in fact, they can do that as well. With native-like use of tense and aspects, can narrate in remote past, which is not easy to do. Native-like use of agreements, heavy use of implicit pronouns, which is the main, you don't use I, you just use the verb with no pronoun as subject. Native-like use of negation, as you can say, ma kunch, mush, arfin, no problem. Small number of broken plural forms. This is the problem with narratives. Narratives, you are at the mercy of the subject, whatever they give you. So the strategy that they develop is called avoidance. They avoid giving you some forms because they have problems with them. But you can still see what they are avoiding. So what we found is that small number of broken plural forms, small number of relative clauses. Relative clauses, things like Alwaleed, illi, and stuff. So you are adjoining 2 clauses, which is a complex process to do. So you have to keep tracks of what is being adjoined, what things mentioned early, and need to refer back to them later. So there is a complex process going on there. Very limited use of the construct state. For example, Kitab al-Walad, you will probably use Kitab al-Walad or something like that. You use the free state, which is more analytic. No problem with the copula, for example, they will not use the verb kana in the present tense because they don't use it. No use of standard Arabic. This is actually, in the beginning, I thought it was a surprise to me. Because we did also some work on code switching in Arabic, and we found that when Arabs speak, especially educated Arabs, they mix standard Arabic and the colloquial dialect. With these heritage speakers, you are not getting any standard Arabic. It's pure colloquial Arabic. And we were talking last night, and you said I can even hear the language of the village sometimes, because they are really speaking authentic colloquial Arabic, because they have not been exposed to the other languages in a context where there could be influence from them. So no diglossia, no mixing of different varieties of Arabic. So the register is very limited. Speaker N, born in the US of Palestinian parents, speaks mostly Arabic and some English at home. Again, no problem with attitude. This one had problems with the agreements. For example, anatadros, wrong choice of the agreement itself. Instead of he said tedros. Or adrost. So you get the ta, which comes from the past tense, and the that comes from the present or the future. So mixing the paradigms. As you say, no problem with the guttural and emphatic sounds. So the pronunciation of the sound is okay. Heavy use of overt pronouns. This is the thing with heritage speakers, you get various degrees of fluency with the language. So we will use, and I did this, I went there, whereas rather than just mentioning I the first time and then dropping the pronoun, just using the verb, keep saying I, or he, she, things like that. This is also an interesting one. Use of the participial instead of the verb form. So for example, إني مشغولة. This is not my mom is busy. No, what she's saying is that my mom works at the university. So for example, she works at the University of Beirut, American University in Beirut. She said, أمي مشغولة في الجامعة الأمريكية. So what she's talking about is a habitual form of the verb. You don't use the participial for that. But that's what she is using for that. And the reason why they are using that, because that's the simple form that you use. Because the inflexive verb is more complex than the participial form. The participial form is a nominal pattern. And when you look at the statistics of heritage speakers, you find more nominal patterns than verbal patterns in their speech. Errors in the use of the errors in construct states. For example, kitab al-walad, you will say al-kitab al-walad, duplicates the different article. Errors in the use of the broken plurals with this one. No diglossia, very few complex sentences. So the fluency is very limited. Here we get the speaker of Sudanese, both parents from the Sudan. Again, not to spend so much time on this, you say, kuntu mawlud, I was born. Okay? So they are using the participial. Different. One is Palestinian, one is Sudanese. They use exactly the same, they are coming up with the same pattern. And look at the participial, actually it's the correct form of the participial, but it's the correct context, incorrect context for it. Okay? So let's confirm this thing, and we are doing the statistics on this. Same thing, conclusion. So heritage speakers are different from native speakers and from adult second language learners. They know the basic and regular patterns of the language, but some struggle with complex forms. Now the current project is bigger, almost done. So we are looking at 3 narratives from 20 heritage subjects. Same number of narratives from the same number of control subjects. So this is larger. What we want to do here is, let me just show you that one. What we want to look at the frequency, at a word count, to count the words, to count the length of sentences, to count the use of prepositions, to do all those things. And I show you just the raw statistics that we have. We are still analyzing them. So for example, these are the subjects S1 to S10. These are the Egyptian heritage speakers. We have the same chart for Jordanian Palestinian speakers. And we are looking at the nouns. As you see, nouns predominate in the, so this is not surprising that the participial is used. We are also looking at number of words in the narrative, how many words they use for each narrative. Because when you look at the control subjects, you find that they have more. And we are also looking at the code switching, how much of English, how many English words they use. And you see again, nominals dominate. So this is still being looked at. And hopefully we are writing a paper on that. So we'll have a report about this study soon. So let me just wrap up. So heritage speakers are different from native speakers and from adult second language learners. They know the basic and regular patterns of the language, but some struggle with complex forms. The environment seems to play a role, and the nature of inputs do play a role in their competence. All code switching that we have found is between the colloquial heritage Arabic and English. The dominant language in English, the non-dominant language is colloquial Arabic, standard Arabic is absent, except in formulaic form, where they give you just an expression that is full expression, memorized expression, but no creative use of the language. General questions that we haven't dealt with and should be dealt with. What roles do contact with the countries of origin and does the contact with the language, with the countries of origin and the media through satellite TV play? That needs to be looked at. How do heritage speakers pattern with and differ from other learners of Arabic as a second language? We looked a little bit at that, but needs to be looked at in more details. Does knowing colloquial Arabic make it easier to learn standard Arabic for heritage speakers? It is not very clear. It needs to be looked at. I'm sure it does, but that's the same. But empirical study needs to be done to gauge that. A lot of heritage students sometimes struggle with standard Arabic. They have no problems in the beginning because you are teaching them the sound, you are teaching them some basic vocabulary. But once you get into syntax, they have problems because suddenly you are encountering syntactic patterns that you don't find in the colloquial Arabic. You are not using mesh and stuff, you are using len and lem and others. You are using inflected relative clauses, you are using question formation that is different from the colloquial variety, you are using a lot of things that are different, and some of them do struggle with that. So that needs to be looked at. Which aspect, if any, of the colloquial variety play a role in learning standard Arabic that needs to be looked at? For example, maybe the notion of the root, to some extent does play a role, maybe some vocabulary items do play a role, but that needs to be looked at. How does the situation of Arabic in the US compare with Arabic in Europe? An issue also of economic status. Arab Americans are economically better. Their income is higher than average in the United States, according to the 2000 census. They are well-to-do compared, let's say, to Moroccans in Holland or France, where they are economically not as successful as Arab Americans. So that needs to be looked at, for example, income level and fluency in the language, the role of the economic situation and social situation played in the language. Arab Americans seem to be more integrated in the language. They do not live in isolated areas, especially, for example, Illinois. Whereas in Europe, North African immigrants seem to be concentrated in some areas. How does that play a role in learning the language and maintaining it, for example? Those are things that need to be looked at. But there are some opportunities I want to end on a positive note here. Because a lot of people, when they talk about heritage speakers, they focus on what they don't have as if it is deficient. But actually they know quite a lot, and you really have to give credit to their parents for getting them where they are in terms of linguistic knowledge. So the thing is to build on that and provide them with services that they need. So this is an opportunity to help Arabs in the diaspora develop targeted programs to maintain their language if they choose to. And this is something I thought of this just to throw it in here. I know this is debatable, but my own personal view is that heritage speakers are more likely to act as bridges between their parents' ancestral lands and their home country, which is the US, for example, for Arab Americans. We see that, in fact, maintaining these links these days are very important. The Chinese are doing that, the Indians are doing that, where you get the second generation going back to the ancestral homes, the parents' ancestral homes, to set up companies or to work and things like that. So maintaining the heritage language can be very helpful in that respect. So I think there is some reason for us to invest in this group of speakers, to work with them to develop the language proficiency. There's a lot of interest from some Arab countries in working with Arab Americans at the United States, especially at universities in Saudi Arabia and other places, where they are trying to maintain some connections with them to advance research. So I think this community is a great resource to use. So it is remarkable that many families have been able to maintain the language. But the resources are missing, because most of the formal institutional programs target standard Arabic. Now, this is not to criticize the focus on standard Arabic. It's an important language for them to learn, and they should learn it. But we have to recognize that standard Arabic is a second language for them. It is not their heritage language. When I say heritage, meaning what you have been exposed early and you speak natively at home. It's the colloquial variety of Arabic. And so the community has to find a way to use that as a tool to get them to standard Arabic if that's the target. Rather than just focus on standard Arabic. Because what's happening in some communities is that they set up programs, they say, well, Arabic as a heritage language, so we are going to teach them standard Arabic on Sunday schools. But that's not the heritage language. Okay, and the way they teach it to them, they teach them in the traditional sense, whereas, for example, I am familiar with the Chinese heritage school for personal reasons, and it's different, the way they teach Chinese. Teach Chinese kids to immersion art programs in Chinese, martial arts programs in Chinese, the spoken variety of Chinese, so that they can maintain that language. So the Arab American community has to rethink how it looks at the heritage language, how it can be used, because there's a lot of negative attitudes towards maintaining the home language, whereas it can be a great resource. So there are problems with the community engagement and commitment. They need to be part. Schools and universities' commitment to heritage languages, that needs also to be looked at, because you go to a Chinese heritage program, it's really Mandarin Chinese, there is no Cantonese. And there is attitude towards colloquial Arabic. Some people think of it as a corrupt form of standard Arabic, which is not, of course. It's a different variety that exists side by side with standard Arabic. And we need to find a way to teach them, to help them with both. And there's, of course, the lack of funding. If you're familiar with what's going on in the United States with higher education, funding is a big issue. And sometimes there's also conflicts of goals. University invest sometimes in heritage languages because we want people who are fluent in some languages, and we think that heritage speakers can get up to that. But the academia, the faculty and community activists, they want to maintain language so that it can be transmitted to the next generation. These are different goals, and one has to find a way to reconcile these two goals. So back to the first question. So what do we know when we know a language? Well, research in heritage speakers, including Arab Americans, has shown that a rich environment and input that is sustainable beyond the preschool years is key to developing native language competence. But more research needs to be done. That's it.
If we have questions, maybe we have a microphone here on, please.
Well, thank you very much. Very fascinating. It seems that in your studies you have really focused on what you can call active language commands. And I guess there's also something as passive language skills. Have you looked at that at all? Just the ability to understand the language.
Yeah, great question. There is a debate about this kind of research, whether you should look at production or we should look at comprehension. I think that's probably what you are getting at. Namely that, let's see, because lots of production always lags behind comprehension. And we haven't got there yet with research on heritage Arabic speakers. Research on other languages like Russian and Spanish heritage speakers has looked at comprehension and what you call passive knowledge. But we haven't done that for Arabic. One reason, but that's not the only reason. One reason is that we haven't got there yet, but another reason is that one has to be careful when working with heritage speakers, because we are limited, especially with Arab Americans, unlike, let's say, working with Spanish Americans, Hispanic Americans. We cannot use the written language, written form, written input to test their comprehension. We have to give them oral tasks, because some of them cannot read and write in Arabic, and at any rate, the colloquial Arabic is not standardly written. So we give them only oral tasks. So what we need to do is to find a way to test their comprehension by using oral tasks only. Whereas when you work in Hispanic Americans have looked at the written, you give them written input, and especially when you do eye trackers and things like that, you're trying to see how they are reading the thing, how they are understanding the input. So that's a great question. You are absolutely right.
I have two questions, but I'll ask them together because they have to do with one another.
Yeah.
My first is, has any research been done into whether or not children who grow up in a bilingual situation like the one you described, whether or not they take longer to learn both languages? And the second question is, has any research been done into whether or not the process that you described, the process of a heritage speaker becoming a fluent speaker, whether or not that process is any speedier with languages for which the written form more closely approximates the spoken form? I gave you an example in my case, right? This is the second time that I've lived abroad, right?
Right.
The first time I lived in France. And I remember my first day in France, after having taken 14 years of French, when someone said to me, "Il faut que tu le fasses." So I went home to look up the verb fasser,
Yes.
not realizing that they'd used the subjunctive form of fait.
Yeah.
Okay, but once I remembered that, those classes came back and I thought, that's right, there's a subjunctive that I need to learn to use again. But here I can't do that. If someone says a word to me that I don't understand, I have no way of looking it up, because even if I, was comfortable enough with Arabic to look it up in a dictionary, that word's not going to be in a dictionary.
That's right. No, again, that's a very good question. With regard to bilingualism and how that impacts the speed of acquisition. I don't know what to say there, because that's not my area of expertise. But there are people who are working on bilingualism. With regard to Arabic bilingualism, there is actually Rabat that Lina works with, who is looking at Arabic bilinguals in Britain. So maybe that's a person actually to read up on her research. We have a student who is looking at early Arabic bilinguals, and what she has found is that there is a difference. It's a very subtle difference that you find. Because even with bilingualism, sometimes it is very difficult to say that they are fully bilingual in both languages. It's always the language that is more dominant. And what the student, she is a collaborator on this project, Ina, has found is that when you look at and she is doing phonetic study, when you look at what they call VOT, voice onset time, she found that the bilinguals are different from native speakers. Now, how does that generalize to other patterns like knowledge of the morphology, knowledge of syntax, knowledge of discourse? That's an interesting question. There may be some answers that I'm not familiar with, because that's not my area of expertise. With regard to acquisition of some patterns, here's my view. I mean, for example, if I were teaching them Arabic, I wouldn't worry about a rare pattern. Let's say, for example, the subjunctive in French. I want them just to be able to communicate, because sometimes that's the frustration that they have. They want to attain some fluency so that they can communicate and feel part of the culture, so that they can do whatever they want to do with the language, communicate with the community, the research, or whatever they want to do with it. So I would focus on the frequent patterns that they are more likely to encounter in the input. But here is the issue with regard to Arabic. We were talking about this last night with Lina and Tamir, and that is, there is a problem with research on Arabic dialects. I do a lot of research on that. Unlike standard Arabic and other languages, we don't have good databases for colloquial Arabic so that we can extract the frequent patterns. That research is beginning to be done, but it is very important research to do, so that we can extract the frequent patterns that you use in a particular context and say, this is what teachers should focus on. And then if you want to build on that and work with standard Arabic, then say, what is the distance between what we found in this corpora of heritage Arabic and standard Arabic? A lot of people in computational linguistics, I work a little bit, as Lina mentioned, and I'm not a computer scientist, that's not my area of expertise, but I work with them, and these are some of the issues that are coming up. What are the distances between the different varieties of Arabic and different and the colloquial Arabic and standard Arabic? Can you measure it? And therefore, can you address it? For computer science or others, it's about translation, machine translation, it's about voice recognition, it's about speech language, natural language processing, and things like that. For us, it's about how can I get you from the relative clause in colloquial Arabic to the relative clause in standard Arabic. But that research requires collecting corpora, and I think really people here and in other places in the area should really focus on that, in my view, because it's a great research to do. There is intense research in corpora in the United States from different areas, whether it is language acquisition, whether it is computer science, or what have you. And we need to get going on that. We have now decent corpora in standard Arabic because the Linguistic Data Consortium, for example, at the University of Pennsylvania, has very good corpora of standard Arabic. There is what is called the Giga World, which is 1 billion words, whereas what you have for Levantine or Egyptian, and now they have also Gulf, it's about 300,000 words, which is not much when you think about it. But that's a good start. We are actually working with those corpora for the other project that Lina mentioned, the NSF one, to do the frequency studies that we are talking about. But that's just the beginning. And that needs something to be done to address what you are talking about.
I just have a minor question concerning sound masculine plural and sound feminine plural.
Yeah.
I take it that when you say that generalization takes place of the ad suffix, you're talking about nouns specifically.
Sure, correct.
And not adjectives in particular. What I mean is that in adjectives, I would expect the thing to be, the situation to be reversed. Because there's many Arabic dialects, because several dialects use the sound masculine plural for the adjectives, both for the masculine plural and the feminine plural. Like Mu'allimat, Shatin, or Mu'allim Shatin.
Yes.
Are there any studies which confirm this?
No, and that's a great idea for a project. Somebody should do it, or maybe we'll try to look at it. But that's a great. We didn't look at adjectives. We are looking at adjectives in the narratives, but we are looking at them for the agreements. But that's a part that we.
So you only have nouns in mind.
That's correct. In that study, we're focused on nouns, not adjectives. But that's a really great question. And part of it is also the dual. In some colloquial dialects, you get the dual. And that's also itself interesting, because if you look at the dual, what you find is that the noun may be dual, but the verb is agreed, which is plural. Yeah. So there's once you start looking into, at this, there is a gold mine of projects, and that, so plenty of people can work on this, and I hope that people do. But that's a great question. Thank you. That's a great suggestion for another direction.
About the narrative study.
Yes.
I mean, how comparable are the control group, the native speaker group, and the heritage language group in their literacy, in the class, in the standard Arabic? I mean, were they? Because I'm thinking in particular about the code switching concept.
Sure.
I mean, if they're fairly comparable, then it becomes very interesting about the context of use. If it's not comparable, then it's more about it's about the degree of knowledge.
Yes. Most of the controllers that we looked at, and I need to go back to the questionnaires and look at that specific question, because we did ask for the education level. Most of them are professionals with heritage Spanish speakers that my colleague Silvina Montour has found. It's an interesting situation. When you look at heritage, because if you look at heritage Spanish speakers, especially let's say in Southern California, there are many of them, and the difference between our situation, let's say, our students here, is that if you look at Illinois, You cannot isolate a particular area and say this is where our community is. There is a community, center, and the kids can go there and they interact and speak. Unlike Spanish, where there is a big population, there are more activities. So some of them that my colleagues in Benmamoun works with have really a high degree of fluency in Spanish. Yet, when the studies were done, many of what you call gaps can be attributed to some lack of literacy in the language. So literacy is very important. And this is something that I didn't touch on, but it's critically important for when we talk about what do we know when we know a language. To what extent is literacy also playing a role in linguistic knowledge? That's an extremely interesting question.
But here literacy would mean in standard Arabic.
That's correct. So can you get code switching? Can you get all those things? For Spanish, can you use different registers of Spanish? For example, in addition to the informal register, can you use the formal register? And for example, people who look at the essays, they found that they are not using the formal register, they are using a lot of informal register because that's what they are familiar with. The language is used mostly in informal contexts. So literacy is quite important. And the other thing is that when we talk about code switching, there is some kind of gross generalization here. I have actually two students who are doing their doctors on the one is the ones on the syntax of code switching, one is looking at morphology. And code switching varies in the Arab world. It depends on the topic. Depends on the education level of the speakers. For example, I had this in the beginning of the slide, but I removed it. It is, you take, let's say, especially with the pan-Arabic TV stations like Al Arabiya or Al Jazeera, you start an interview with formal Arabic, and then you get, let's say, the moderator is from here, from Sham, and the interviewee one is a Moroccan and one is an Egyptian, and you get an interesting linguistic situation, but that depends. I mean, we have to record this actually because we are doing the studies. And you get an interesting mix. But the degree of code switching depends on the topic. Is it religion? Is it sport? Is it business? Is it an academic subject? It depends, and it depends also on their education level. So that's something that needs to be looked at as well.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.